I'm a folklorist and Director of Education at City Lore in New York City. And I'm here with my colleagues who are also folklorists and also work in the public sector. And we're going to be sharing out some of the ideas we discussed in a recent panel on fieldwork methods and programming. The issue that was interesting to so many of us in those discussions was how do we deal with some of the challenges of collaborating with the communities we work with around sensitive issues about what we can document and to whom we can share it out and in what form. Many of us work in communities where we're documenting traditions that are sacred or that are only restricted to women or men. There are all kinds of issues around how those kinds of traditions are documented. And we've learned through our experiences, hopefully, and we'd like to share out some of the things we've learned with you about our fieldwork experiences. So I'm going to have my colleagues introduce themselves and give an example of a challenging fieldwork or programming situation and how they dealt with it, and it can be either successful or unsuccessful, but what you learned from it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Amanda. I'm Pete Rashevsky. I'm the Executive Director of Center for Traditional Music and Dance in New York City. And we have a program called we call the Onsky Institute for Jewish Culture, which documents mainly Ashkenazic Jewish folk traditions, specifically music, dance, instrumental music, folk song, and dance traditions. And so through that project, we've kind of been working with different communities in New York City, and there's certain understandings of, first of all, just to say it, is so much of Jewish music, particularly Ashkenazic Jewish music, is infused with sacred music. So it draws on cantorial music or paraliturgical music. So even if it's a secular form, say like klezmer, which is instrumental music, it really has a lot of resonance of the sacred musical traditions in it. So there's a lot of sort of places where you really have to be careful how you navigate when doing field work or presentations, documentation, issues of sacredness. And so I guess there's sort of three spheres that I think about. One is contextual, one is around particular repertoire, and then the third would be even around particular words. So to talk about contextual issues, first of all, in more Orthodox communities, there's a whole issue with what they call kol isha, which is the voice of women. So men are, in a way, prohibited from hearing the voice of a woman, like singing or things like that. And different communities have different interpretations, whether if the woman's voice is heard through a microphone, if that's okay, or on a recorded basis, if a man could hear a recorded voice of a woman. There's different interpretations of that from community to community. Another example of contextual things you have to navigate would be liturgical services. So on certain Jewish holidays, Jewish holidays like the Sabbath or in the high holidays, there's a prohibition against work, and so video recording or different documentation would be kind of prohibited in that sense. But also, so there's questions of how to document, high holiday services, and those are the repertoire, the nusach, which is the melodies that get used in the service. And then, so the second sphere would be repertoire. So there are particular nigunim. Nigunim are these wordless melodies that originate from the Hasidic community, ultra-Orthodox community, where there are particular nigunim, which are really, they say, you're only supposed to sing this nigun or hear it on a celebratory day. So they have either like a wedding or celebrations. They have days like Fieldworking, which is Fieldworking is a get-together, a Hasidic get-together, often in celebrating the birth date or death date of a famous tzaddik, which is a famous rabbi from past times. And then the third area is around particular words. If you talk to a very Orthodox person, they might change the word. They're not supposed to use the word of God when they're speaking in a sort of a profane way. So they'll change, instead of saying the word God, they'll say, insert things like Hashem, which literally means the name. So they'll say Baruch Hashem. If you say, oh, you're looking good, they say Baruch Hashem, which means really bless the name, which is supposed to refer to God, but they're not supposed to say the name. So those are different layers of navigation that we deal with all the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think sacred things are probably the trickiest in some ways of all the situations that we work in. So Dan, introduce
Yes,
yourself.
I'm Dan Ward. I'm with the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. And we've been doing a lot of documentation out in the countryside along the canalway. And some of the things that we run into are just how does our audience, and we often don't know who that audience is, how will the audience react to the material that we've documented? I can think of a couple of examples. We're just finishing up a feature-length documentary called Boom and Bust about economic cycles along the canal corridor. And we've shown a number of audiences some of our earlier edits of this. And one of the things that came back with one group, we showed a group that was largely interested in economic development, and they really liked the film, but they did point out that we start out with a big boom, and then we get mainly into a bust, and it doesn't ever resolve into anything that's the least bit hopeful. So we went back and took a look at that, and very, very easy. We had hundreds of hours of film to work with, so we were able to, I think, bring a more positive note to it. Another one that I think of is just people will say things that tend to be self-incriminating sometimes, and you don't really think of that. But we had one gentleman who worked on one of the tugboats, and he said that his first day on the job, someone came up and asked him, let me ask you a couple of things. Do you like to drink beer? And he said, sure, I love to drink beer. Do you like to play cards? I love to play cards. Well, can you keep your mouth shut? Yeah, I can do that. Well, you'll do fine working here on the canal. And it was very, very funny, and I think he was really engaged in telling this. But I was showing it to a group, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I was very interested in that one segment. Here's my card, and he was that man's new boss. Fortunately, didn't have any problems from it.
Well, I think that issue is one where a lot of times we try to negotiate with the people we're working with about how they feel about what can be shared, and sometimes we have to decide whether we have a responsibility to them to maybe cut something that they thought was perfectly fine. I think that's when it gets tricky.
And it was a very good illustration, I think, but it also potentially could have been dangerous.
Disastrous, right? Okay, Arliss.
Well, I have two examples, and as you were talking, Dan, I thought back to a teachable moment from a colleague of mine's early teaching days, and I send this one out to Jamie Morera up at Memorial University, but we were all starting to teach together, and we had a section, Intro to Folklore, where we talked about fieldwork ethics and archival ethics, and one of the examples that he brought into the discussion was a tape from a student assignment where people were assigned to go out and document a conversation, performance with a local band and a conversation with the local band about their history and so forth afterwards. And then you were going to turn these cassette tapes into the archive at Memorial to be preserved forevermore. And Jamie used to use this example. He would just play the example in class, and there was this interesting discussion about how the culture of the band got started and who started it and what they liked about their playing together and then what the music meant to them, blah, blah. And in the background, they could hear this sound, and the sound was it was like and so Jamie used to use this as an example. This is worthless to us. We can't put this into the archive. So, you know, that's just one example of materials that you might think are working, and then, you know, you listen to them at the end, and this is completely useless. So,
Well, those are great examples, and I'll just finish with one that I had with I was studying a Ganesh Hindu, the birthday of Ganesh, which is a 10-day festival for a big program on sacred arts in Queens, and some of the temples would not allow us to photograph the ceremony, but one did, and I had to really grapple with whether, because that one allowed us to, should I really do it, because the others didn't want us to. And finally, they convinced me that it wouldn't be a problem, and we photographed it over the 10 days, and then the last night, we went to Flushing Meadow Park, and they walked this clay statue of Ganesh, the priests do, into the lake, and put it in, and it dissolves and releases his spirit, is the idea. We weren't allowed to photograph that sacred thing. But anyway, I felt very good about how I'd been very careful about this issue. And then I was interviewed by someone for the Newsday, and he interviewed me all about my work. And he said, have you ever done anything late at night? And I said, well, no. And he said, nothing late at night? I said, oh, actually, recently I was about 2 in the morning, and I described the ceremony and how it was sacred, and we weren't allowed to photograph it, and we stood there and watched. And then the paper came out, and it said, what, pray tell, is Amanda Dargan, who grew up on a farm in South Carolina, doing at Flushing Meadow Park at 2 in the morning, shoving a statue into a lake? So all of my good work, you know, was sort of out the window, and I had to go apologize. And I learned a very good lesson about what you tell to reporters and how you share out to these audiences that you never imagined would see the work. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.